So started out, first thing is building a solid, flat, stable workbench for building everything on. And while the kit was on order and we were waiting it to arrive, we set up the workshop, we organized everything so that when we were done, we could unpack all the parts and have everything cataloged. You can literally spend, 3/4 of your build time just trying to find the parts that you're going to add to it if you don't organize ahead of time and be able to have everything ready to go. Plan your work your plan, put something every day. One of the vast things, I cut out television and I cut out my RC hobby, and pretty much that funded my my build. I spent some of the time being able to bring family into it to get help with the plane. There was always either a family or friend oftentimes would join me in the build. And my son Halden, who originally we were going to build everything together, he only put about maybe 1/4 of the hours in that I did on it. But it was still helpful, and I had a local friend who I brought in who from church. He was retired, and he was interested. He heard I was building a plane. He was interested in helping out, and I said, "Well, what are your, what did you used to do?" And he goes, "Well, I worked at Boeing for 30 years." I'm like, "Yeah, come help." And the first day he comes down and he looks at my work table and he says, "What is that?" And I said, "It's an elevator." "Oh, an elevator. What does it do?" I'm like,
"You're in accounting, maybe?"
"Oh, you worked for Boeing for 30 years. I goes, "Oh yeah, I mostly did orbital calculations. I'm a mathematician." So I worked for doing orbital dynamics and space stuff, So anyway, but he was very helpful anyway, even though he didn't know a thing about aluminum or airplanes or riveting or whatever. But he learned, and only once did he drill into my hand. But again, hotline from the kit, absolutely important. But figuring out how to keep track of your build, keep your build going, do something every day, bring the family in, don't procrastinate. Make sure that you're going to have everything you need for the next step of building ahead of time, especially in the now with the pandemic and everything. Brake pads taking 8 months to get to, engines right now being forever backlogged if you can get one at all. But also it's you can get burnout from doing too much and trying to get too much done. Being able to do it with family and friends is super helpful. Yeah.
Did you get any good help from your tech counselor on that project?
I did. I had him visit a couple times, and definitely recommend doing it once you've started out and built it a substantial amount so that you're early enough to correct errors, but late enough to detect where you're maybe going off course. Yeah. So finally, we got the big box. We organized everything. Again, having we looked at what we were going to need for each stage. But one of the things in terms of planning is I didn't have a huge workshop. I had a 2.5 car, 1 car wide, area plus a tack room. It was part of our barn, for the horses. And so we ended up. I ended up deciding, doing the wings. We just started out with a rudder in the workshop. Then we built the wings, and then the empennage and the flaperons and things like that. Stuff that we could hide away and get out of the way so that once the fuselage is built, it takes up all the room and it demands attention. And all the expensive stuff is there. So being able to get all the work done on things that you can actually put aside and get out of the way really helps in terms of space management. And so we staged everything with all the parts for each of the sections of the build that we had, made sure that all the other things that were not included in the kit were all provided and brought in early, bought early and accomplished. Things progressed. my parents were both dying of Alzheimer's at the time, and I ended up having to spend a lot of weekends going and taking care of them. So there were a lot of like life got in the way times, and so my schedule ended up stretching out from the original 1 year to being 18 months from box to first flight, or from DAR. And that still, it's like, for me, I knew that if it stretched out too long, it'd never get done, right? So I had to keep that hurry. So in Arlington flying in 2018, our EAA chapter was asked to provide a booth for the fly-in. And so if you can see around here, there's all these derelict airplanes that never got finished. And I had been seeing at the EAA booth there these same derelict bodies for years. And I went to the chapter president and I said, look, we need a real building airplane where kids can pop rivets there, and that we actually have a kit that's going to fly. And this year we'll show it being built, and next year we'll have it with the wings on and fly, you know. And so that's what we did. I brought my whole workspace out. And we brought the rivet guns. We put on little shorter legs for the feet, and we had kids popping rivets all weekend at Arlington. The other thing that is super, super important in flying and experimental, especially if you're going to be doing the first flight yourself, is transition training, being able to know how that flies. I'd flown Cessnas, you know, big Cessnas, fat Cessnas, skinny Cessnas, and, you know, different Archers and everything like that. My plane doesn't fly like any of it. It is a very, very different beast, and it has very different temperament to it. Being able to go to some place where you can really, you know, understand how that plane feels, especially important when you're going to do, if you're going to do your own first flight. You're going to maiden it yourself. That plane is an unknown state, and you need to be able to deal with anything that comes along, and that you're inexperienced and the plane's inexperienced.
So where'd you go?
So I went to some place that is the best using an airplane as a deadly weapon instructor that I've ever been to. The guy is absolutely bat crap crazy, and I showed up in Tennessee. And I look, and it is 29 gusting to 35 knots, mostly crosswind. And I say, so when should I come back? And he goes, boy, where are you from? And I go, Washington. Where are you at? I go, Tennessee. What'd you come to do? Fly your plane? Get in the freaking plane. I did not use the front windscreen for the first 2 days. It was like this, you know, landing sideways. And I mean, some of it, I swear, you know, the plane touched down at the gust speeds. And so you'd just be like setting down like a helicopter in some of it. And it was absolutely crazy. I thought I was going to die the first probably 8 hours of flying with this guy. He was really good. The conditions I flew in were so insane that there's never legitimately any time I'm ever going to be in anything like that transition training. So everything else from there was just downhill. So, I spent about 13 hours and 165 takeoffs and landings in their planes, you know, getting confident that when I was going to go out and fly my plane that I could handle anything. I was going to fly on a calm day under known conditions, you know, in as favorable conditions as possible versus the, you know, the mess that we were doing there. So finally, this gets us around to, I have the airframe done. I'm ready to power this. I had chose all modern avionics because I wanted I wanted a plane going where I chose I wanted IFR instrument, but I wanted legacy free. So I have no VORs, no NDBs, no ILS, which has been a little bit of a pain, but recently we've got a lot of relief from that from the FAA. The FAA decided that all their memos saying that you had to use 3 different navigation systems was all misinterpretation, and the plain language is that you can use GPS for all of it. I tried to get a DPE for my IFR check ride in my plane. last June, and all the DPs in the area said they wouldn't do it because of the memo. I'm going to try again this spring, and hopefully within memo rescission on that decision, I'll be able to actually take my check ride in there. I've been saying I've been working on my IFR since 1986, thanks to the FAs.
Did they have weather back then?
Yeah. So I wanted, if I'm building a modern plane, I don't want an engine that was derived from the 1930s. Yes, they're reliable. Yes, they'll run without electricity and everything like that. But they also blow up and fail for a lot of reasons that nothing in a modern car engine would ever do. Right? I mean, your spark plugs fouling, that's a thing that you do not get in a modern car engine. There's a lot of things that from airplane engines, a lot of problems I had, like, dealing with all the mixture and the controls and carb heat and everything else that you have to deal with a plane. It's like that is just, so unnecessary, and I wanted something that was going to be modern. I wanted, good performance, good fuel economy and things like that. And because I'm building experimental, I didn't want to just pay for a certified plane engine that's going to be insanely expensive, just because it's built to optimize for FAA regulations, and the fact that certifying an engine is so expensive a process that it keeps new innovation from coming into the field. I mean, they finally got, last week at Sun and Fun, announced the first dual electronic ignition option for certified airplanes. Yay, we've gotten to the 60s now. No, I mean, so for me it was since I'm going experimental, if I want a certified engine, buy a certified plane. So I looked at Rotax, UL Power, which Zenith was representing, and Viking. After looking at cost, benefit, performance, and everything like that, the one that had the best cost and the best performance, the one downside it had was a little heavier than UL or Rotax, but the extra thrust that it gained and the wide power band because of the Honda VTEC gave it the edge. It also had something that was a feature when I looked at Rotax. Getting the Rotax that would be comparable in performance was 3 times the price or more.
Turbo.
For the 915 IS or whatever. And it priced it out of the range, so it wasn't even the competition. So I'd have to look at being down 30 horsepower. And the other thing is pumping the same oil through the gearbox as goes through the engine just seemed like a failure point. If something goes wrong with one or the other, you lose both. So I looked at, it uses gasoline direct injection. So that it's like a diesel. It fires directly into the cylinders. And with the ECU and everything, it completely optimizes for fuel economy and power. And they provided a complete firewall forward kit for the unit. Cowling, everything you need. Now the cowling is not you have to adapt it. You have to cut it and make sure that it fits your plane. It seemed like a lot of work, but in the end it actually didn't take as much time. It wasn't as annoying as I thought it was going to be, and it came out looking really good. So I was pretty surprised. In fact, some of the quote-unquote turnkey cowling that you're supposed to be able to just put on together that people bought for the UL.
You still have to modify it.
Oh, you still, and it's even worse is that they don't give you enough material so that if you have a gap, you end up having to fill gaps and things like that. And just molding that just didn't fit and everything like that. And so other people who had supposedly had more, less work on their cowling ended up spending more work than I did on it. The downside is that there's no redundancy on the spark, the ECU, or the gearbox. If any of those things go, you're not flying anymore. Well, I mean, you're flying, but you're gliding, or you're parachuting out, depending on your policies, whether you're Trevor Jacobs or not. At any rate, but on the flip side of it too is each of the spark plugs has their own individual controller that's all independent. If one of them fails, you still have the other 3 cylinders. The types of things that make you need multiple spark plugs on a 1930s design engine are not the types of things that fail often at all for hundreds of thousands of miles in these auto engines. And so a lot of the just reliability of the fact that they build millions of these things provide, along with adapting towards the aviation uses, provides a sort of level of reliability that I've really appreciated and enjoy. And it's been, the engine itself has been bulletproof. I had some, not exactly self-inflicted, but I decided to be very experimental about things, and I'll go over one of the one issue I did have and sort of like the level of support I got in dealing with it. So got the power plant installed. It was amazing. I did it by myself. Just went to the Harbor Freight Tools, got a little engine hoist on there, and the thing was on in something like 20 minutes. Just really, by myself. I was really, shocked. I'd never done this level of engine. When I used to race cars, we put Porsche engines through the back. So ironically, I have a car engine in my airplane, and I had an airplane engine in my car. But the support from Viking was absolutely unbelievable. I would be like looking at oh, what's the torque parameter on this? They're on the East Coast. It'd be 8 o'clock at night at Harvey Field, and I'd text the owner of Viking on, and I'd be like, okay, maybe he'll get back to me in the morning. And then 5 minutes later, 170 pound meters or whatever, boom, there's your spec. And I just, day or night, these people just don't sleep or something, because they're unbelievable attention and support weekends, evenings, and those are the times that we work on things. In the fuel system too, I didn't want to be a John Denver, right? I wanted to be able to have reliable fuel on things. I wanted as much redundancy as possible in everything where I couldn't. There is one input to the fuel itself. The gas direct injected high pressure fuel pump and all that. That's part of the thing. It needs to have 30-ish psi or more coming into it from it. There are 2 header tanks. There is the wing tanks. Each go through a fuel filter into a header tank. The header tanks each have their own embedded fuel pump, wet fuel pump, each with their own check valves on there. And then they go from the fuel pump into a connection block where they go through another check valve. So if the primary check valve fails, so you can't have fuel come back on itself, you can't cross-feed tanks on it. And then that fuel rail comes off through the high-pressure fuel pump, the fuel flow sensor, and the fuel pressure gauge, so that you can see what the output is on it. You get totalizer for everything. And then there is a tiny, tiny pinhole that flows back into one of the tanks for relieving pressure. So when the fuel pressure is turned off, you can't get back. It will allow enough bleed-off back pressure so that that you won't have the fuel system pressurized after you've shut the plane down. The only thing that you can't do is if you blow out half of the tank, one of the fuel pumps, you can't pump from the other wing. So you can't cross them. There is an option that I could have had them cross-feed each other, but if you have contamination or something like that that affects one, then you got both of them done. So it's like you're trading. For me, the plane can fly more than double my bladder capacity, and so I'm really not going to be ever putting this where I'm going to get into a low fuel situation. So for power redundancy, I have dual independent batteries in there. Each of these are these new lithium cell batteries that have built-in battery management and status on there. What's that? EarthX, yeah. They weigh next to nothing. So a pair of them gives you far more redundancy than lead acid batteries for much less weight. You could, even stack up more of them if you really needed to. They can both be isolated, one or both in use, and you can also run everything with the battery shut off on the alternator itself. And so essentially, you've got triple redundancy. You can lose any two of the other systems and still be able to fly. On top of that, all the avionics are powered by a 4-hour battery backup. So if they lose their power for the 10 minutes that you'll have to glide down, you'll be able to keep your avionics running for another 3.5 hours after that. So if you happen to lose all three power systems. So now I have a replica of the panel up here, but ended up with going with Dynon HDX 1100 as the primary flight display, and integrated that with ADS-B in and out, all the nav control. Had a Garmin G5 as my backup EFIS. Different brand, different connection that can all run independently. If the Dynon completely fries, I can still do a IFR approach with the Garmin G5 and the GNS 625. And again, then I have an iPad that's built into the panel that just slides in, is powered by the panel, connects through Wi-Fi, gets all your positional information, and if need be, it can actually run its own non-air based data and provide you with an EFIS panel that you could fly in an emergency if everything else failed. So that gives an additional redundancy. And it also has a GLONASS GPS-like thing that's not dependent on the same GPS signals. And so if you have a total WAS and GPS failure, you still actually can have a good latitude, GPS-like signal for navigation on the iPad, even if everything else were to go wrong.
It's not politically correct anymore.
Yeah, so using good Russian technology. There is no NDB, ILS, VOR. It's all legacy-free. The downsides of that, of course, are GPS blackout, and the military sometimes does jamming. They are all NODAM'd. You can always ask controllers. The utility of being able to take your iPad, slide it out, go to your flight planning, bring it in, sync it with your panel is really pretty amazing. So this monster, in the panel design, I used I do a lot of electronics and stuff myself, and I know just how hard it is to get every connection right. And I knew that it was worth investing in having someone do the cabling system. So I went with this system called Approach Fast Stack. And what they do is you give them all the specs for everything you're going to put in your panel. And they have a hub and cables that that are custom made for each of your devices, and then an interconnect programmer plug that goes in. And it basically, you provide power, ground, and put your signals to the sensors. And all the other wiring is all pre-baked in a highly professional environment. You just install it in your thing. I've had no squawks over 200 hours so far, and absolutely no squawks at all in any of the avionics. It's worked perfectly from day one. The only thing I have an issue with is sometimes having the cords on my 30-year-old Dave Clark headphones, get a little encrusted, but that's not the fault of any of the panel. So I bought a panel blank from Zenith. I laid it all out with the Dynon components and everything, actual size, then got the cutout markers, cut it all out with snippers and various saws, and then wrapped it with this carbon fiber look, material. Put it all together. I think it looks pretty great for a homemade panel. even liked it so much I had to have one I could take home with me. And in the back I can demo that unit for you guys. So that's what it looks like in flight here, approaching Deception Pass. So we ended up hauling the plane out to Harvey Field and realizing that 90% done, 90% to go, that commute between my house and Harvey was impossible. I was never going to get the plane finished. And Harvey was so frozen, my hands wouldn't, spending an 8-hour day was like torture. And so after one weekend, I decided it was untenable. So even though I had gotten the hangar, I basically left it empty and I moved everything back. And I kicked my wife and all our 3 cars out of the garage in the driveway for the first time since we've been married. One of the views is the garage is for a car. You know, if you have to park your cars outside, something's wrong with your life. Get your priorities straight. So we ended up being able to put 2 of the cars parked under the wings. But I found that my garage, even though it was a 3-car garage, the tail was too tall to fit and rig. But then I realized they tilt. And I just put a block underneath the front wheel, and I was able to completely rig everything in there. And then, unfortunately, I had a fully assembled plane now, and I needed a Sawzall to get out. But no, so we disassembled it, and then I did put it back into the barn for painting everything, and ended up doing the paint myself. It was a big pain in the ass. It's probably 100 pounds of extra paint on there. But it looks a lot better and it holds up a lot better than just the raw aluminum.
What is the empty weight?
So the empty weight is about 950.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's paint, heaters, GPS, full interior, spared no expense options on it. The other, so as we're coming up to this, especially now with the FAA, reserve your N number ahead of time. Register your plane ahead of time. Especially now, get your N number in. They are registration transfers and everything are taking months, and people are having to deal with temporary things. But for me, I learned this trick. If you overnight it, they take it seriously. And I sent it overnight. I sent it Monday, and Thursday it was in the system.
Wow.
People were telling me, you know, it could take 6 weeks or whatever. So don't snail mail it if you have a choice. It always helps. Again, schedule your tech counselor. He wants to talk to you all the time. So get connected with them and learn everything you can. Getting in touch with the insurance company. I went through a Vemco for builder's insurance because I didn't want to have that much put together. In a garage that could be broken into with all the avionics and everything like that. If my garage got broken into, I didn't want like a huge amount of stuff all pilfered or anything like that. It was a few $100 a year, good deal. But then they wanted something like $6,000 a year for coverage of my plane when I was going to fly, and they didn't want to cover the first 10 hours of flying. I'm like. So
That's the important part.
I called Falcon, and for like $1,700, they covered me from the first flight. And my transition training was fully accepted, and it was there. Then, you get in touch with the DAR, find out what they want, what they need. I had everything laid out, all the donuts, coffee.
Talk about builder's log.
My builder's log was like that thick. So I was paranoid about the DAR possibility. When the DAR came in, he just like flipped through a couple of pages in my builder's log, and that's it. After the whole thing, I was kind of like, I did all this stuff. I apparently didn't need it. He says, sir, when I sat in here, there was no possibility in my mind that you had a ghost build or anything like that. This was your project. You knew everything about it. You did the owner. I didn't have to go check all that stuff because I trusted it would all be right. Because everything I've looked at, he found one nut that wasn't tightened down when I had done some last minute adjustments on the flap, and it was something that couldn't physically move anywhere, so it wouldn't have ever been an issue. but technically needed to be tight, and that was the extent. So I had a clean bill of health on the DAR. But I think panicking about making sure that I got everything made sure that I was the guy who was worried about not passing and passed with flying colors. And he says the people he worried about are the people who have no concerns whatsoever and then have a plane that is completely unairworthy. And so it's like being diligent to, overthink through everything. Register your with the state and pay the sales and use tax. I have a slide on that later on about the problem. So after went through all that, got cleared for first flight, got my airworthiness certificate. Had some specific provisions against dropping, putting weapons pods on it or dropping anything or trailing anything from it, which I was kind of like, that's kind of weird. But then, other people told me some of the reasons why those existed. So, first flight. I use the EAA test log. They have a whole test kit on it. It's totally worth the money. It helps you plan how you're going to do it. In the end, I didn't do it exactly as specified in the whole thing, but it was a guide for really preparing a good test flight program. One of the things, it said is just like, first flight, avoid doing a lot of complexity. Don't, be actuating flaps. Don't put wheels up and down if you have them. Make sure that you get the baseline and leave all the optional stuff out. They also really highly recommended not to doing high-speed taxi tests. They said there's more trouble than they're worth. I wanted, the night before what would have been my first flight, I decided to do a high-speed taxi test. And I decided to take off like a Cessna would. And I firewalled it. And I was going to, the factory pilot says always put the nose wheel up first, get the nose wheel unloaded. So I pulled back on the stick, and the plane just went like that, like a helicopter. And the next thing I know, I have like no rudder authority. I'm hanging on the prop, and I'm drifting off to the runway with full thing. I know, and I'm like, what the hell just happened here? I read it. I thought it sounded the same, but no, I had to try this. Again, it doesn't fly like a Cessna. So I pulled the power back and dropped it down into the grass at Harvey there and found the only bump in the field. I got my rudder all crammed up with grass, and I bent one of the aluminum landing gear. So I had to park this thing and wait for a new landing gear. That was all the damage that was done. Is the one wing was about 2 inches shorter than the other after it was done.
Lower.
Yeah, lower. Yeah, it's 2 inches lower than the other. And so I got the new landing gear. Now it turns out, ironically, if I hadn't had that accident, I wouldn't have found out that my nose gear I was custom built to be 4 inches taller, and they accidentally sent me a 4-inch taller replacement landing gear that made the plane ride correctly. And so it was, by accident, literally. But if anyone wants used slightly bent landing gear, okay. So second flight, I've got a video for this. So I was following the Cessna stall recovery practice that I'd done a million times in 172s and 205s and everything like that. And so what do? You hold, you get into the stall, you hold the back pressure. When you get your slow and you get the brake, you release back pressure and you roll on the throttle, right? That's the standard thing. This is what I did, and this is the result. So we just basically got mush. And then I'm like, okay, well, that's as much stall as I'm going to get. So release the back pressure, put the throttle on. EFIS is over G, over G. Pilot must change underwear soon. Yeah, so surprise, surprise, it doesn't fly with, like your daddy's Cessna. The plane goes so deep into a stall and just mushes. Right, but when you have to have forward, very forward control forces to get the wings both flying again, and then you can add the power. If you add the power while you're in that mush zone, one wing starts flying because of the P factor and the other isn't, and you get the snap roll where you just go upside down, and the next thing you know, your 700 feet altitude is what I lost on that when I went back and looked at the log. And if you look at that, that's about as fast a perfect recovery from that as I could have done, other than not let it happen. And that's still 700 feet. So almost took a bath in Lake Stevens. Okay.